It's Matt Duncan. I'm a forever buff. I work here at CU Boulder in social media strategy. I also teach a class in social media listening. And having worked in social media for about 10 years, I'm continually fascinated by its relationship with an impact on trust and truth, the good, the bad, and sometimes the ugly. It is big and small at the same time. One moment you're involved, and the next time you're an observer. So are we living in a post-truth or trust society, as the description of this session asks? I don't know. But I do know that I'm super excited to be up here with a pastor, a pathfinder, an investigator, a software seer to find out though. So you can read the full bios of all our panelists via the CWA webpage and their respective blogs and websites, which I highly encourage you to check out. So the process here is I'm going to introduce all the panelists with a couple quotes I found that resonated with me related to today's topic. Then each panelist will speak individually for about 5 or so minutes, after which they'll have a chance to address each other with comments and discussion. And then we'll go into questions and answers. So as you think of questions, get them into the app or note card and we'll get them up here and I'll get them to the panelists. Also, since I work in social media, I have to plug social media. So let's make our networks get a feel for the awesomeness of this session. Tweet a lot during the session, and when you can, tag with CWA Boulder. All the speaker handles are in the app, except for Chris, Dr. Tom Ford. We got to get him to get on a Twitter account here, so let's all kind of nudge him to do that.
I have a story about that.
All right, cool. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to introduce each of the speakers here. So Jerry Michalski, aka the Software Seer, is the founder of Rex, which is a think and do tank that helps leaders navigate massive change. Their theory of change is the relationship economy, and the relationship economy depends on a healthy commons. After spending a few minutes reading about Rex, I ended up in Jerry's brain. That is the outboard version, like many others also have. He's going to explain a little bit about that in a second. It's pretty cool. We're not kidding. So I could have spent a lot of time there, but I had to get back to work. So I continued on and ended up to a very relevant crowdfunding effort for today's panel entitled, What If We Trusted You? Jerry can tell us more about this if he wants, but the first few lines of the description, I thought, provided some great prompts for today's discussion. Trust is one of those words we think we understand, but mostly we don't. In particular, we don't understand the role of trust in designing our institutions. Worse, a few of us question how our institutions are designed. We humans are so adorably adaptable, no? When we design systems from trust, we get better results that cost less and have terrific side effects, like rebuilding community and releasing our inherent genius. So that's from Jerry. So moving next, we'll go to Christopher Tom Ford, Dr. Tom Ford, or Chris. Chris is a Reverend Doctor and President Emeritus from Moravian College and Theological Seminary. Finding out information about Dr. Tom Ford online was a bit more challenging compared to the other panelists, but I did find one really cool fact that I think some of you who might have seen him speak yesterday already know. Dr. Tom Ford, or Chris, was on the cover of Sports Illustrated as a basketball player for Princeton in 1967.
Not the swimsuit edition.
And if I read correctly, the curse actually worked for that too, as the team lost to Cornell the next game. Right. So the curse of the Sports Illustrated cover is real, for those who know about that. So as I was surfing around, I found an article from 2011 from NCAA Champion magazine. And the first line in there, and then a quote in there kind of resonated with me. So Moravian President Christopher Tom Ford likens his life to a series of interstate highways that start randomly but converge briefly before dividing again. I thought that was profound, related to relationships and what we're talking about here today. Then there was a quote he said, I've always wanted to be part of a small group of people. Perhaps this came from my basketball experience, who were in community with each other and who wanted to provide some kind of service of value to others, and who had a spiritual as well as intellectual base. Tom Ford said, the small liberal arts college does that. So again, I think we were talking earlier about the smallness and bigness of the topic that we're talking about, so I thought that was pretty profound. Next up, we have Andy Laren. Andy's a senior editor on the NBC News investigations team. From WikiLeaks to substandard Chinese chemicals tainting U.S. pharmaceuticals, I think it's pretty safe to say that trust, either present or not, is a major part of Andrew's world. You can read more about all his fascinating and extensive work, but I want to call out Andrew's involvement in Achilles International, where he has guided a terrific runner who happens to be visually impaired for 4 marathons, one of which was above the Arctic Circle. In an essay that Andrew wrote in 2017, he awesomely, and I mean that, you got to check it out, describes the race above the Arctic Circle, guiding Elina Oidvin?
Elina Oidvin, yeah.
Okay, sorry about that.
Norwegian.
One quote from the article stuck out that again relates to today's topic. She dislikes the tethers preferred by some blind runners. Instead, she wants guides to run beside her and describe what lies ahead. As I prepared for the big day, I found myself looking at Rhodes differently, thinking how I could quickly tell her what she needed to know, hoping I didn't get tongue-tied as fatigue set in. So again, on the individual level of trust and truth that we're talking here. And last but not least, we have April Riney down at the end of the table here. April is the founder and advisor of April Worldwide. April advises startups and established companies, local and national governments, policymakers, think tanks, and investors, and contributes regularly to news and media about the new economy and future of work. April has traveled to more than 100 countries, worked in more than 50, and lived overseas for more than 10 years. There is proof, and I highly recommend checking it out, of the many amazing photos of April doing handstands in all these places on her website. And if you are in the Twitters, there's one of her up in Mount Sanitas, I believe, recently.
Yeah, the Continental Divide.
Yeah, okay,
Yes.
Continental Divide. So, in September 2017, April wrote a great post called "What Global Citizenship Is Not," and this part resonated with me for today's discussion. We're entering an era in which layered identity is not only possible, but increasingly taking root. Individuals can be connected citizens, national citizens, e-residents, and global citizens simultaneously. There are different layers. These different layers serve different needs and ends. They are complementary, not exclusive. Not surprisingly, they also prompt a range of questions and tensions about corresponding rights and responsibilities, as well as new channels for agency, community building, innovation, and impact. And Jerry and April are married, so.
We do like each other. We're just bookending this morning.
So enough from me. I'm going to hand it over to Jerry, and we'll just walk down the panel here and go from there. So thank you.
Thank you for the wonderful introduction, and I'm really, really happy to be here. Before I start, just if I do this at any point during the thing, some of you are familiar with this, it means I agree with what's being said. This means I disagree. Feel free to use these, because it'll change our relationship into a little bit more of a relationship of trust, where we're no longer just speakers on the podium and all you can do is maybe clap. And we get a little temperature reading from the room, like, oh, that struck some interest over here or over there, but don't expect us to stop everything if you do this. So. I love this topic, honesty, trust, all those sorts of things. There are many different paths into the topic, and I think that you'll see those emerge as we go across the panel. Just to start, I'm picking one that has me really worried right now. And one of my bigger concerns is post-truth a 5-year detour or a 200-year era, right? Because you get the Enlightenment, and then you get Romanticism, which is kind of a backlash to the Enlightenment and everything else. We have long eras of human thinking capacity, ways of being, and my real concern is that science, the press, everything else are being very successfully undermined at this point, and that proving a fact, whatever a fact is anymore, especially if you're a real scientist and you care about scientific method, and facts are very hard to pin down in science, is getting hard in the public sphere. So where do we go with that? In particular, because some actors in the public sphere, and I think you may know who I'm referring to, are actively undermining our trust in institutions, our trust in one another, provoking fear. They've discovered that this is actually a very successful weapon for winning elections. And I don't just mean the Cheetos Jesus who runs this country, but so, and my apologies for the Jesus reference. Oh, I like that, thank you.
Take it.
Excellent.
He agreed. Jesus agrees with it. He told me.
But I also mean the global rise of the far right, the alt-right, all over the place. There was a panel earlier at CWA that I attended that was all about that, and it's frightening, right? Bolsonaro, go to any country, and even in countries you thought were completely democratic and doing fine, the right fringe is growing like crazy, and we've somehow opened the door to breaches of norms, to losing the path on being in connection and trusting each other. And my thesis overall is that despite that, and despite the fact that there are thousands of reasons that humans are actually not very trustworthy, if you've ever explored behavioral economics, you know a piece of what I mean. We are subject to incredible biases and fallacies and stupid things we do. I think trust is actually the way forward, the only way forward. We've got to figure out how to come back into community, how to come back into being together and solving these problems together in an era where we've been intentionally divided. I just read a book by Steve Kornacki, Red and Blue States, which is sort of the history of the division in our Congress, and it sort of, you can lie this at the foot of Newt Gingrich. So Newt divided the Congress. He basically made sure that nobody roomed together, exercised together, ever spoke to the other side. There's a much bigger story behind it. But since then, we've had this scorched earth strategy. So part of my sort of approach is, how do you act when there's a scorched earth approach that's working really well, when facts are being undermined very successfully, right? And I have great concern about this next electoral cycle that we're just now at the start of, because I don't think the left or the press has figured out what's being done to them. They do not understand that owning the media cycle is the new form of power, and it doesn't matter whether the chyron says something negative or positive. It is completely irrelevant. And there's only like 1 or 2 players on the political sphere who understand that. So how do you fight that? What do you do? So worse than that, our principal communication and social platform, let's call it Facebook, is now the largest country on earth, country in quotes, but it's 3.2, 3.5 billion people. China's what, 1.4, right? Crazy, crazy, biggest country on earth. And its business model is about addicting us and then farming out our data and selling it off to other people to pound us in what is known as the stalker economy, or surveillance capitalism. Raise your hand if you've heard either of those terms, the stalker economy or surveillance capitalism. Shoshana Zuboff just wrote a book titled Surveillance Capitalism. We are nostril deep already in this. China's a little further with their social credit system. What do we do? So I think that this question is very timely. It's really important. I think that trust is our only way forward, and I'll stop there.
Thank you, and I'm delighted to be here, but I'm also sad. Imagine a culture where you have to debate whether honesty should be a fundamental principle of relationships or not. I can't imagine such a culture. So I feel a little bit sad this morning, but glad that you're here to debate that. Or if not debate, ponder or wrestle or wave your fingers, whatever the case might be. I take honesty to be fundamental in human relationships, whether in organizations of great size or of small gatherings of this kind. Last night I went to a restaurant. My brain was overwhelmed by all that I had heard and seen and perhaps said. And I depended upon the honesty of the menu to provide me with information about what I could eat, and that the numbers next to it, I'm not good at numbers, I'm a theologian, we only know like 3, 12, 40, eternity, maybe that's not a number. So honesty is crucial for me when I go to a restaurant. How much did that Cobb salad cost? Was it really $18.95 or some other number? I depended upon the honesty of the waiter to bring the food that I had told him I would like to have come. And I've worked in restaurants. I was blindly trusting in the honesty of the cooks not to do something nasty with my food. So I think honesty is somewhat fundamental to just getting from here to walk downtown, to get a meal, and to show up this morning more or less healthy. Secondly, I didn't know much about the word honesty, I must say. I didn't know what it meant, but I found many connotations or many words that could be substituted for it. Let me read some of them to you. Straightforward, trustworthy, believable. I was surprised to learn, even though I studied Latin a long, long time ago, the root of honesty comes from honorable or honor, honest, reliable. How could we live in a culture without those kind of attributes being fundamental to how we relate to each other in all the many ways we relate? My wife and I, when we retired, needed a dining room table. I'm a pastor, as was said. I've always lived in some house owned by a church or university. I didn't own any. I owned very little furniture, for that matter. So we were referred to a man by the name of Mr. Zimmerman. We lived in eastern Pennsylvania. He's an Amish man. He doesn't have a website, and so I called him on the phone. He was a man of few syllables. I said, do you have a catalog we could take a look at what you're making? He said, no. Have you sold other pieces that might be in a showroom somewhere? Maybe. Well, how can here's what I have in mind for a table, but again, I'm a theologian. Who knows what it would look like if I built it? Well, he said, come on over. So on a piece of paper, he designed an honest table. Simple, clean lines, 100% cherry wood, made by him and his son. It's absolutely beautiful. I'm almost sort of afraid to eat on it. It's so simple and honest. I thought, what if honesty didn't exist in that relationship? So honesty and the fundamentals of relationship. And I think also honesty takes a lifetime to develop in us. We all make mistakes. We all drop the ball. If you didn't, I would be out of business. I've heard lots of confessions in the last 45 years of work. So honesty is something about the character of a person or an institution. It's not a momentary, accidental quality that we might take on, like spontaneous bravery or heroism. Honesty takes a lifetime to develop, it seems to me. Third, I don't think Donald Trump is the problem. I don't. He is a problem, but not the problem. I don't think media is the problem. Here are some of the difficulties of honesties that I've encountered that seem problematical to me. I think the complexity of systems that we all live within can cause breakdowns of trust, deficits of trust. For example, I retired on June 1st, 2013. On July 7th of 2013, I got a telephone call from Fidelity. And they said, is this Mr. Tom Ford? And I said, yes. And then I proved it by telling them my mother's middle name, my favorite color, the name of my dog when I was a little boy, and how tall and how heavy I was, at least when I first registered with Fidelity. And she said, well, I'm sorry to tell you, you're not eligible for a pension anymore. And I said, gee, that's disappointing. I plan to be healthy for a while. Why is that? She said, well, according to our records, you're 55 years old. And I said, well, what do you have down as my birth date? She said, January 25th, 1947. And worrying that I had been like Rip Van Winkle, I said, well, what is today's date? Whatever it was, July 7th, 2013. I said, well, do this for me. If you write down on a piece of paper 2013 and underneath it 1947 and subtract those two numbers, what number do you get? And I'm not good at numbers, so maybe I was 55. She said 63, or 66, excuse me. I told you I was not good. 66. I said, well, that's how old I am. And she said, well, I'll be damned. And I said, not yet, that's my business. I forgive you, all is well. Just keep that check for $2,700 coming each month. And we'll be, if I ever meet you on the street, I'll give you a hug and a kiss, if that's acceptable and appropriate. So the systems are complex and leads only to mistrust and confusion. Secondly, I think we have the image, the metaphorical, the story image of the trickster alive and well. I think Donald Trump is a trickster, like Rumpelstiltskin. And we need to be careful of that image, because the trickster in all the fairy tales that I've read to my children, grandchildren, and perhaps you've done the same, is never defeated or overcome by active force, counterforce. The trickster is defeated by naming the trickster's name. And so honesty requires us to take a look at ourselves and the image of the trickster alive and well, not only Donald Trump, professional athletics. Let's deflate the ball slightly so we can win the Super Bowl and see if we can get away with it. Let's see if we can get $30 million from a sneaker company to buy 5 players at a nationally reputable university to see if we could win the NCAA, and don't tell anybody about the 30 million from Nike. Let's see if we can get away with it. So I think investigative reporting is part of our salvation, naming the name of the trickster, pulling the curtain back. Finally, I think we each can be part of the solution, perhaps like an antidote to this giant indigestion of our common body, if we take responsibility for our own mistakes. I was the president of 3 small colleges, nothing like the United States, nothing like the University of Colorado. But one time, but many times, but one time I did make a serious mistake of judgment, and I forced through an issue that was wrong. So I met a group of people like this, the faculty, and I said, you know what? I was wrong. I take full responsibility for what has happened. I will make reparations for what has happened. And so we don't need to have a constant looking and searching to find out what was wrong. What was wrong was me. And you know, I never had trouble with that faculty again. And that's a diverse group of people, and there's always kind of a natural industrial tension, appropriate tension, I would say, between the administration and the faculty. But from there on in, great. So honesty has to do not only with what did he do, what did they do, how did Fidelity screw up, but it's how about me? Am I acting and behaving in my relationships in a way that's honorable, reliable, and honest? Thank you.
So for the record, I still feel guilty that there's like religion and the media that's coming between a couple.
Law and gospel.
Okay. Thank you all for coming this morning. So one of the things that, just seeing this kind of topic sentence out there, one of the things that I wanted to talk with you all about was, in newsrooms, as we get attacked for being fake news, as there are accusations that somehow there's like, a daily 10 o'clock phone call from the Trilateral Commission telling us what we're supposed to write, when there's all these kinds of theories that goes into like, oh, that's why I'm seeing this in the media today. I thought I'd break it down for you and tell you exactly how an investigative story can come about. Because I think that sometimes one of the things we don't do well is explain our work. So just so you know, I tend to work on long-form investigations. I spent about 13 years at the New York Times. I just went to NBC News, where I'm a senior editor on the investigative team. I've done stories like going through the diplomatic cables that Chelsea Manning leaked to WikiLeaks. I've gone through the Snowden files. I've done stories that have led to a complete overhaul of how the military provides hospital care to veterans, and also how the military goes about tracking suicides among those in its ranks. I've done stories about criminal justice that have led to reforms. But I wanted to talk particularly, since you mentioned one piece in particular, I thought I'd kick it off with that. Looking at the pharmaceutical industry. So how does a story like that come about? It comes about because there was a moment where a cough syrup company decided that it needed to maybe save a little money, so it outsourced its production overseas. Not that there's anything inherently wrong with that, but they were starting to get a chemical ingredient from China to put into their cough syrup, and they got it at a good price. And it was ostensibly regulated the way things are regulated in China. No one knew any wiser. Until children and people started dying in several countries around the world because the chemical that they were putting into the cough syrup was antifreeze.
Whoa.
And the reason they were putting it in there is it was cheap and no one was watching, is the short answer. Okay, so that's a breaking news event that was really well covered by 2 of my colleagues at the New York Times. But we then were brought into a room and we said, okay, well, this is a really interesting event. What more can we find out? Is this a one-off, or is this part of a larger pattern? We don't know the answer to that. it might not be part of a larger pattern, in which case we're about to spend months spinning our wheels. Or maybe it is. So one of the things that we hew to in investigative journalism is what we call the verifiable truth. Or as one of my panelists kicked up yesterday, the old journalism adage, if your mother says she loves you, check it out. Okay, great. So I'm thinking, so they've asked me to come in and say, like, what do you think could be another story? So I started thinking about this, and this is the way my mind worked. And at this point, there's no editors telling me what to do, just me trying to come up with story ideas of what we may pursue. Something like, okay, what do I know about the pharmaceutical chemical industry? Next to nothing. Okay, great. So how do I think it works? Well, I imagine it's like any big industry, and they probably have conventions and conferences. Okay, great. What's the gold standard convention that if I were Merck or Sanofi or any of the big drug makers of the world, what would I be going to? So I looked it up. It was going to be a big convention in Milan, Italy. And I could actually get a list of every single company. You know, you go to a conference, you get your little brochure of who's going to be speaking. You get this, and you can see all the different exhibitors and panelists. That's a list. Those are documents. I can use that. Okay, so what do I see when I go through that? I start looking at it, and I was like, about a quarter of all the companies at this convention that of all the big players are from China. Okay, that's kind of interesting. Who are these companies? I don't know. So we go check it out. And so we start backgrounding all of these companies. And we start going through documents. I start making far-flung calls to Nigeria, to Interpol. I start going through inspection records from customs officials in the United States. I go through court records around the world. And at the end of the day, we get to, so this is why I was fumbling for my phone. I apologize, I don't normally do that. At the end of the day, we have a story that begins like this. This is on the front page of the Sunday New York Times sometime, I think, in September 2008. Milan, Dateline Milan. In January, Honor International Farm Tech was accused of shipping counterfeit drugs into the United States. That's from court records. Even so, the Chinese chemical company, whose motto is thinking much of honor, that's from their website, was openly marketing its products in October to thousands of buyers here at the world's biggest trade show for pharmaceutical ingredients. Other Chinese chemical companies made the journey to the annual show as well, including one manufacturer recently accused by American authorities of supplying steroids in illegal underground labs, and another whose representative was arrested at the 2006 trade show for patent violations. Also attending were two exporters owned by the Chinese government that had sold poison mislabeled as a drug ingredient, which killed nearly 200 people and injured countless others in Haiti and Panama. Yet another chemical company, Orient Pacific International, reserved an exhibition booth in Milan, but its owner, Ken Chu, could not attend. He was in a Houston jail on charges of selling counterfeit medicine for schizophrenia, prostate cancer, blood clots, Alzheimer's disease, and other maladies. Now comes what we call the nut graph. All these things, by the way, are documented, court records, everything. While these companies hardly represent nearly all of the 500 Chinese exhibitors, more than from any other country, they do point to a deeper problem. Pharmaceutical ingredients exported from China are often made by chemical companies that are neither certified nor inspected by Chinese drug regulators, the New York Times found. Because the chemical companies are not required to meet even minimal drug manufacturing standards, there is little to stop them from exporting unapproved, adulterated, or counterfeit ingredients. And this has led to injuries and deaths around the world in the pharmaceutical supply chain. Those stories went on to win the Pulitzer and lead to reforms in how the chemical industry works. All of this is based on documents and countless interviews. All of this takes months and months of work. And I told you how the story began. So fast forward, how did I spend the last year? I spent the last year working with leading NBC News team of more than 20 journalists and working with ICIJ, the folks who brought you the Panama and Paradise Papers, to investigate the world's medical device industry. and I know next to nothing about medical devices except I got a couple of them. That's about it. So medical devices, what do I know about them? Not so much. We start thinking, like, what are some of the stories that we might be able to do? Well, the first thing we do is we gathered records. We gathered public records from countries around the world. We gathered public records that had never seen the light of day by anybody because they were kept under seal with various governmental agencies. The US is a little bit better, but even countries like Canada, not so good. So we got all these records, and then we started going through them. Now, I started saying, like, if we're getting all these international records, one of the things I want to do is start checking, you know, what happens when we smash records from one country against another country. What do we find? I had a thesis that was like the reverse thesis of what I just read to you, which is like, I wonder if US companies, when they have a recalled product or a troubled product or a product that's not going well, I wonder if they dump it overseas. It's a question. No one was telling me to ask this question. It was just a question. But one of my remits is I can spend weeks going through a question for which no one has ever written an academic paper on, a research paper on, has ever done a story on before. And I found a squirrely little law inside the US Food and Drug Administration's rules and regulations. It was passed in the late 90s. And what it allowed is for US manufacturers to ship export-only devices to any country around the world, and they do not have to undergo any FDA scrutiny, supervision, examination, inspection whatsoever. The thing you need to know about the medical device industry, which I did not know, which is that the FDA has more inspectors than all the leading developed nations combined. So, like, we're considered the gold standard. So when another country sees made in the USA, they're thinking, good stuff. So I'm thinking, wait a minute, they don't have to be inspected. They don't have to be regulated. No one's really checking. I know what happened when this occurred in China. I wonder what's happening in this case. That led to the initial story, the very first story in this international collaboration. We titled it Exporting Pain. What we found is we found many US companies, but I'll tell you about one. It made shoulder implants out of carbon fiber. They put them in people's shoulder, and we found people in Italy and in Australia where the shoulder literally imploded, leaving black remnants of carbon circulating somewhere in their bone. Just so you know, that then leads to what they call revision surgery, but surgeons have a problem because you've already cut into the bone to put in the first implant. So now you got to do a second implant, but you got less to work with. You can kind of figure out the cascading problems that ensue. People die. We found devices that lead to emergency surgeries, possible deaths around the world in the developing and the developed nations. No one had ever done this before, but it began just by following records, the verifiable truth. That's how we go about doing some of the stories that we do. You can read more about the implant files. I'll be glad to talk with you more about those later. Among the other things I try to do, and I think several of us do this, is teach. So I just want to go back to your story, your restaurant. You're going to go eat. I have a student who said to me a year ago, I'm really interested in food. I said, that's fascinating. What do you want to do about it? And she kicked around a couple ideas. I said, I don't know how to verify any of the things you're interested in, but those are intriguing subjects. But here's public records that are available about food, in particular, New York City school cafeterias. Yeah, cool. So New York City, if you don't know, has this great mission where they want to provide a free meal to every single student. 1.1 million students a day get free meals for breakfast and lunch at school cafeterias. Mm-hmm. Let's go check out the records. What do the records show? 1 out of every 2 school cafeteria has food violations. 1 out of 4 of school cafeterias have serious critical food violations that can lead to sickness, foodborne illnesses. We trace those to actual illnesses that led to outbreaks where kids could not go to school. We then checked the records against census records, and we found that, guess what? It's the poorest schools and the more minority schools that have the crappier cafeterias. The story was done by my students. They published it on the student website. It went viral. all the New York media, television stations, radio, print, NPR, all picked it up. So when you're ordering number 27 off your menu, you know, come with me and we'll yeah. But that's the verifiable truth that we go down. We didn't know what we would find. It's since led to reforms. It's led to national awards for my students. But that's how we go about doing what we do. So.
Thank you.
Thank you, and good morning. I'm delighted to be back here with these great guys, my husband, all of you. So I want to keep my comments brief because I have a funny feeling there's some really good Q&A in today. But I want to add one layer that hasn't been touched upon so much thus far, and it's the role of technology. And to some degree, I mean, technology is everywhere in what we've been talking about. But just by way of context, I'm trained as a lawyer, and I have a finance degree as well, but I still remember my products liability classes and thinking about who can we trust, what can we trust. Why do we contract? We contract because we don't trust. A contract is an agreement that's put into place for when things don't go as expected. Now, Jerry and I could talk forever about how we've actually built an entire society from the basic premise that we can't trust one another. That's how we end up with a highly litigious society, et cetera, et cetera. As a lawyer, though, I've come to really question what would a society that is based on the premise of trust and trustworthiness look like when it comes to things like products liability, litigation, and so forth. So that's one piece. The first half of my career was spent focused on business model innovation at the base of the economic pyramid. So looking at this from the perspective of global development, international finance, topics like microfinance. Who's familiar with microfinance? The provision of small loans, right? So I cut my teeth professionally on microfinance, which when you think about it, it's all about trust. Why would you loan money to somebody who has no ability on the surface to repay? Well, turns out microfinance will perform better than any commercial loan out there. 2008 happens, commercial banks, where we've contractualized and transactionalized everything, blows up. Microfinance globally barely notice a blip. They're like, yep, because we're making loans, especially when they're group loans, to groups of individuals who know each other. Now, the hook and the beauty of microfinance is if anyone, say you have a group of 10, if any one person doesn't repay, the group is on the hook. What are we building there? It's not about money as much as it is social capital, social ties, social trust. So that's another piece of my chapter, another chapter of my book, I should say. We could talk about that. But more recently, for the last decade, I've really been focused on this concept of, and I have to put it sort of in quotes today, but the sharing economy. The collaborative economy, business models based on access over ownership. So car sharing, ride sharing, home sharing, co-working spaces, et cetera. I was in this space long before it came to me in almost everything under the sun. So go back to that original genesis of the sharing economy. Why would you get in someone's car? Why would you stay in someone's home? And it's like, are you kidding me? Which I always find really interesting because it really underscores the degree to which the societal norm is we don't trust each other, which is really sad. I'm sad to be to be saying this for a different reason. So over the last 10 years or so, I've been working with a lot of startups in this space. I also work with governments and policymakers around the world on how do you regulate business models we've never seen before that are based on this and access rather than ownership. Because again, whether it's insurance, we've built insurance for ownership, not for access. We don't know how that breaks down. But insurance is a lot about trust as well. So all of this coming to say that, and also the other piece I want to bring up here is that probably 80% of what I do is outside the US. So what are other cultural and societal norms around trust? And it's interesting because no place on the planet is trustworthy at the societal level. But you know, I've worked, for instance, in Colombia, where they've had decades of civil war. You have very high trust amongst individuals, societally, very high levels of distrust, but then, and this is something I find routinely, very high levels of high levels of trust immediately people around you, high levels of distrust at the national level, but then anyone who comes to visit that place from another country, for example, very high levels of trust again. And I grew up partly in Italy, same thing. You've got two people, somebody from Rome, somebody from Florence, sorry, I should say, somebody from Florence, somebody from Siena, if anyone's familiar with, Italy is a country of nation states. Yeah. The Florentines and the Sienese, I mean, they live 30 miles from each other. Ooh, this is major distrust. And both of them are highly distrustful of Rome, for sure. The whole country is distrustful of Brussels. But if you're from the US, you're pretty cool, So I'm like, this is just fascinating. So the piece that, I do want to keep these comments brief, the piece that I want to turn back to, though, is this whole sharing economy and the ways in which, and again, not perfect, there are bright spots and there are blind spots, for sure, but the ways in which technology has, to some degree, helped us build trust that was not naturally there before. Not perfect. Want to be really clear on this. But there's this concept of what's called stranger trust, which is really interesting. And what you find in the sharing economy, and again, I always bear with me with that term, okay? It's, Uber is not the sharing economy, even though it likes to call itself that. It is transforming mobility, but there's very little that's shared about your traditional Uber ride. There is something quite shared about Uber Pool or Lyft Line, where you are literally sharing a ride with 2 or more people in the vehicle. Because I'm looking at this from the perspective of economics, are we saving money, are we earning income in new ways, but also environmentally, are we using resources more efficiently? And the real ringer for the sharing economy, when you look at those models that are truly the best in class, it's when some aspect of that transaction builds community. Now, this doesn't mean that you become best friends with the person you share your car with, but the fact remains you get to know more about what's happening directly around you, as compared to if you and your neighbor both own your cars versus you share the car, you do develop a different kind of bond. And so if we just think about how we can harness technology in responsible ways to help overcome some of these bridges. It's fascinating, again and again, in the sharing economy, what you find when you survey people, like, would you do that if they've never participated in any kind of platform, and I'm pretty agnostic as to whether it's a car or a house or whatever. Very high barriers to entry. I couldn't do that. I don't trust them, And then, typically what happens is somebody who has done this before signals, just try it, right? So levels of distrust are very high before the first transaction. After that first transaction, which, gotta say, usually it goes just fine, surprise, surprise, plummets, the resistance, it just drops dramatically. And by second transaction, same thing, third, same, and then they're like, why was this ever such a big deal? And so it's fascinating because I find, and I'm looking at this in terms of how do we model for others, how do we, at the same time, I like to say, we're really, through the sharing economy, I think we're uncovering some of our, not just biases, but our blinders that we have on. Now, at the same time, and I'll just wrap on this point, at the other end of the spectrum, you don't want to look at technology as some kind of naive, blind trust, or assume that it becomes a proxy for human relationships. You do still want to make sure that a place has insurance or whatever, responsible business. You want to make sure, and what's very interesting, for instance, accident rates in shared vehicles are lower than in owned vehicles. People tend to treat the assets of others when they know that there is this social capital involved in the mix very well. But when we transactionalize everything, and with all due respect to Airbnb, if I'm staying in someone's home, I'm going to care for their home. If I'm staying in a corporate short-term let, I'm going to treat it like a hotel. And it's fascinating to think about when you're staying in someone's home, how do you treat it? Why is that different than a hotel? Why do you leave the towels on the floor? A lot of it has to do with this human relationship. And so I'm kind of, casting forward, thinking about how do we best harness the good about technology that can build and foster stranger trust, while making sure we don't slip down that rabbit hole of just assuming that technology will somehow be a proxy for trust. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. We're at about 25 minutes left, so take a few minutes if y'all want to comment on each other, then we'll get to some Q&A.
Let's hear from the Q&A.
All right, we could jump to the Q&A. All right, so starting with some student questions here. I think these are similar, but you'll let me know if they're not, so I'll just call out two questions at the same time, and then leave it for y'all to pick. If trust is breached, how should we as a society respond to it without undermining what we already have? And then maybe related, maybe not, is there a point where we as a society should let some things go? Is a greater truth more important than the white lies?
Yes, I would let some things go. The tricky part is to know what to let go and what to seize upon. A strange image is coming to my mind of Dwight Eisenhower. For some reason, I was a little boy when he was president, and later, and I thought highly of him then. Later investigated material and histories and so forth have pointed out some of his weaknesses. I guess I'll be, as a citizen, I would let some of those things go. It's good that they've been revealed, and he or his family or somebody should take responsibility for those things. But in his role as a general and president and college president, I would be willing to accept the better part of his national service and let his own difficulties go. In the weight of his speech about the military-industrial complex, as opposed to him having a mistress, I think his speech is more important.
If I can jump in, I'll sort of take this back to the current electoral contest for a second, and a concern I have that we were talking about in the car this morning, which is that on the right side of the aisle, it seems like any breach of trust doesn't matter, can be overlooked. Nothing is bad enough to get rid of the person in office. On the left side of the aisle, every small thing but it's an off with his head or her head kind of transgression. Yeah. Like, we don't have a culture where, hey, something wrong happened, let's sit down and figure out what to do about it. Like, nonviolent communication sort of tries to figure out how to sit people together and talk through and mirror each other and find some resolution. But the idea that any bad actor doing any bad action should be ostracized and exiled has a bit of a damping effect on anybody ever stepping forward, right? But it also means we're going to kill ourselves on the left side of the aisle. So they're talking about sort of a circular firing squad effect on the left, and I'm seeing it. I'm seeing that there's sort of no leeway for behavior, but maybe worse, there's no conversation about the behavior to bring us back into society. And if you go to the Dagara tribe in West Africa and figure out how did they treat a youth who had done something bad, they sit in a circle, elders sit around, everybody sits and talks about it. It's really, Siri just responded to I said they sit in a circle, and my device decided that I was speaking to her. But we've had ways of dealing with this. Breaches of trust shouldn't end in our complete exclusion from society.
Just very briefly, this is more of an anecdote. I'm always reminded of my time in microfinance with Kiva. Who's familiar with Kiva? Small loans? Right. So I was their legal counsel when they were 3 months old, before they had a business model or anything. Trying to figure out how to keep the lights on. And early in their history, when they really did not have the resources to do due diligence, they were flying by the seat of their pants, but with the best of intentions. And they were partnering with microfinance institutions in Uganda and Kenya and Tanzania at that time, pretty limited. But their first, and they were, people were giving Kiva money and they were passing it along, and they were taking zero for themselves. Part of what I helped them do was figure out how can they actually keep the lights on, because they'd promised, we're not taking any of this 100% through. In any case, their first microfinance institution partner ran off with the money. They're at a point where it was the natural you're like, ooh, this does not go well, and they were so small that it was highly likely that they were just going to fold up shop. And so there was just this, and they trustworthy, they knew these people, they'd stayed in their homes, there were the traditional metrics of trust were there, but they were halfway around the world, and when push came to shove, when they went back home, like, okay, there was very little they could do about it. And they had this heart-to-heart about, like, what do? We cannot tell people. This is not only embarrassing, this looks irresponsible, this is the end of us. But ultimately what they realized, what did you say, trust is the path, is the only way, or whatever. They were like, there's no way, what are we gonna, we're gonna either tell a lie. We have to tell people what happened. Mm-hmm. So they got up all their gumption. They were 100% transparent, truthful, and said, and this goes back to the sort of, if this happened routinely at Kiva, we would have a big problem. Yeah. But they had this very big transgression. And they just came clean and sent an email to whether or not your money had ended up at this microfinance, everybody. This has happened. We are profoundly sorry. Here's what we believe happened, but just bared their souls. Kind of, what did you say? It was like the emperor. I mean, they bared themselves. Now, interestingly, what do you think happened? Not a single person. Everyone was like, thank you for telling us. We don't think any less of you. We actually, what's very interesting, Kiva's history, we think more highly of you. You are trustworthy. Mm-hmm. Your integrity just shot through the roof. If you look at Kiva's growth, that was the day they started to do this. And so that's not to say that they didn't have transgression, that they didn't have challenges after that and non-repayment here and there. But I pull a lot on this example because what their instinct societally was, don't tell. Right. But they realized that they wouldn't be able to live with themselves, plus that was just not the right thing to do. And so transparency, truth, led to far greater trust and trustworthiness of the individuals and the organization as a whole.
Thank you. Here's another question. As a doctoral student studying shared governance, I'm finding that morals, ethics, and lack of trust are the biggest issue, parentheses, specifically in higher education. Any thoughts? And laughs.
Done.
Yes, I think there are some real deficits of trust in probably everywhere, but since I've worked for 30 years in higher education, yes, there are real difficulties there. And I think a lot of it has to do with what April just said, different groups within the college or university losing track of the mission or purpose of the place, namely the education of the students and the service to the larger communities of which a university or college may be part. It was my responsibility, I often thought as a president, simply to keep people reminding them of that. Raising money for the institution is important, but only insofar as it supports these other 2 points of mission. Granting tenure, building buildings, wrestling with all the issues regarding athletics, or one of the schools I was at, the choir was like the Notre Dame football team of that school. How to keep everybody focused on mission. And I think what Jerry just said about the power of a community coming to address a problem is very, very important. This wasn't a college, but I was a chaplain in Attica Prison for a number of years. And I was responsible for a group of men who had 22 felonies each. That was their qualification for coming into the group. So they had more than 100 years of prison time. And these are serious crimes, not like tax evasion. They killed people and burned down things and wrecked stuff. But after 8 years of meeting every Friday for 3 hours, trust did develop in that group, and that group of men began to respond amazingly well about what their responsibility in life was all about. So I think the more you can get people together in higher education and keep people focused on the mission and reward people for support of the mission, the better off the institution will be.
All right, Andy, a question for you. Newspapers and broadcast TV are in decline. In the future, how will investigative journalism be financed?
It's a great question. They got an answer for that?
Trust.
Well, and actually, so here's as we stand today, here's pretty much the economic reality. At the national level, places like the Washington Post, the New York Times, NBC, the networks, CNN, NPR, they're okay. They're not great. They have issues, but they're okay. The part, this is that thing like you don't know how bad things are when things are missing. It's not like you're seeing something bad. It's the absence of things. The things that we really worry about in journalism, for those of us who've been around a while, is the coverage that's happening at the local and state community, state houses. So for instance, it used to be that there would be 20 or 30 or 40 reporters at a typical state house in a big state. We're down to a handful. And what that means is that among those 20, 30, or 40, there'd be several people who'd be assigned to doing long-term stories, digging deep, maybe going through campaign finance records, maybe going through contracting, maybe going through the kinds of things that lead to indictments or lead to actual changes. When you're down to a handful of reporters, those reporters, their job is basically to do that day's summary of events, which is not digging as deep. That's what you're losing out right now. We're already there. So right now, the economic model is we have a few white knight billionaires who now own the LA Times and the Washington Post. We have some of those same kind of people funding nonprofit news efforts. That includes ProPublica. It also includes, my dear colleagues at places like the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, ICIJ, that did the Panama Papers. So we kind of are at that economic model. Where does this go from here? I mean, it's kind of clear where the slopes are going. So maybe 5 or 10 years from now, national news remains pretty steady as more people subscribe, people keep watching, paying attention. But at the state and local level, that's where the real worries are, and I don't quite know the answer to that. And we have what we call news deserts. So maybe you can drive across certain parts of the country where there is no community newspaper or community radio station. How does that get filled? That's really where we're worried.
Question? Okay. Sticking with business or on business, it is easy to build trust through multiple successive and successful transactions. It is easier to break the streak with only one example of deviation. My question is, how can businesses prepare for the broken trust, and what does the business process look like after breaking trust, especially if biz model is based on the social capital? Does it paralyze the relationship?
I'd love to jump in with that. So it's funny. Usually you don't really know that somebody's trustworthy until something has gone wrong, right? Like, we can be convivial. M. Scott Peck, the author of The Different Drum and The Road Less Traveled, has this theory of community in The Different Drum, which is lovely and a little bit narrower than you might think of community, because it's like, everybody in this room, we're a community, or all left-handers, you're a community, all Toyota owners, well, Jeep owners more or less, maybe Harley. But there's probably a very high proportion of Jeep owners in Colorado. But he basically said we start in pseudo-community, and then something happens. Something breaks. And then we have the choice of we leave, and you don't really want that, or we sort of give up. But then the path, he said, to true community was through what he called emptiness. And it's when you say, the reason I reacted the way I did when you said X is because I grew up in this way and this happened to me. And this emptying of putting yourself in the space leads to the kinds of trust you need. That's great in a group of humans. We've probably all experienced something like that. What happens for companies, right? So I'll take you back to the Tylenol disaster. Yeah. And basically the company that owned Tylenol responded in model fashion to the disaster. Somebody had been injecting strychnine into the capsules of painkiller, and there were people dying. They immediately pulled all of the product. They immediately investigated what was happening. They invented the child-proof cap and then put product back out on the shelves. Doesn't that sort of warm your heart that we were once that way? Because there's so many local crises, VW's Dieselgate, Boeing and the 737 MAX right this very minute, where really stupid software decisions made for really stupid business decisions appear to have killed a lot of people who had no business being killed on those flights, right? So part of the problem is we have very few ways for corporations to come clean on stupid things they've done, and they're all under insane Wall Street pressure. It's mostly the pressure. The other pressure is not so much Wall Street as the senior executives are making most of the money. They all have huge golden handcuffs, golden parachutes. And yeah, well, the golden handcuff is a thing too. Yeah. Exactly, it's a sweet contract deal, right? But they all have huge golden parachutes, so they're trying to maximize their out, and they know that their tenure is going to be pretty short. So they're entirely focused on short-term impact just on the stock price again. All of which makes for very stupid situations where you get what Andy was reporting on a moment ago, right? It leads to that over and over and over, and we don't have. I would love there to be some way for a corporation to figure out what skeletons it has in its closet and declare a Truth and Reconciliation Commission for itself. Right. For itself. And say, we don't want our asses sued into oblivion and out of business. We'd like to stay in business, but we've got a couple bad things, love canal, whatever, that we would like to confess in exchange for reparations or whatever else. If you know the difference between retributive justice and restorative justice, RJ, restorative justice, look it up on Google, it's extremely different in how you approach the perpetrator. Again, coming back into conversation as opposed to destruction and ostracism. But we're in an off with their heads society right now, and I think that's one of our big problems.
Go ahead.
No,
because
sure. So just very quickly, so in the news business, we make mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. Every profession, every person makes mistakes. So our model is if we make a mistake, we have to correct it. And so corrections are attached to stories, and we try to explain why the error happened. Maybe a government official gave us bad information. That sometimes happens. Maybe an editor trying to make the story more readable made a mistake and compressed information, and it came out bad, the wrong, at the other end of the equation on deadline, and the reporter didn't have a chance to say the editor made a mistake. So you'll see the editor made an error, or the reporter makes an error, or it's from this, but we have corrections that get attached to both stories. One change you've seen in news stories in the last few years is more and more, we used to say, like, this is what we know, and we'd assume that when you read a story or saw something on the nightly news that you knew that was what we knew. But now we're also more willing to include sentences that say, what we don't know is X, Y, and Z, because we think we need to spell that out more so people realize that there is a body of knowledge that we think might be out there that we just can't know at this point in time. The documents aren't there, sources aren't there. It's somehow being held secret. So there's that. You can, of course, go through almost a Rain Man-like litany of things that have gone wrong in journalism. Janet Cook, Jason Blair, blowing up a GM truck. I've heard it all before. Yeah, those things have all occurred. The way the news media has there still is news to report, and so the best we can do is try to say, here's what went wrong, and I was not involved in any of those things, by the way, but here's what went wrong, here's what went wrong, and we're going to explain why it went wrong, we're sorry it went wrong, and we're trying to fix it so it doesn't happen again.
April, then I'll...
Well, yeah, and I was actually going to say, it's interesting because exactly what you said right now, it's a direct link to what Jerry was saying, and I'm just thinking a lot recently about Boeing, because not least I went on my first Boeing factory tour last year, and it was astounding. But the number of workers and employees and suppliers, how much pride that company takes. And this is not the fault of the engineer. You know, this was business overriding humanity, so to speak. And I do feel like if they could take that step, that Boeing, I believe Boeing is routinely, it's a very trustworthy company. You can't be in aviation without, you know, this is massive, but this sense of they have a very unique opportunity right now to do exactly what you're describing, and they'll get through this. But if they don't, and if they, you know, let's see how, I think today's discussion we should all be watching what happens from here, because I think it's a direct application of some of what we're talking about. I just want to make a very brief point about in the platform economy, sharing economy, those sorts of things. Absolutely true. You go multiple transactions and something happens. The beauty, and again, not naive, do your homework, but there's a similarity between microfinance and the sharing economy in this respect, which is the social capital, the social collateral. As a participant, the one thing you want is to be able to continue participating. So the companies need to be really clear on what rules and expectations are, but after a few transgressions, maybe one, it may be 5, you will get booted off that platform. The super savvy ones are the ones to know how to identify problems before they may happen, but that's one where the worst thing, and this is bad for the platform, they know that their reputation and integrity depends on having a certain minimum level of trustworthiness throughout the community. So they need to communicate those rules very clearly and then follow through with actions, you know, match the words and their actions when it comes to, you know, removing people from platforms, and whether, again, that could be on the supply side or on the demand side and so forth. And this is one of those cases where watching it over the years, it's still clunky, but we are light years ahead of where we were 5 or 6 or 8 years ago in this regard.
And a quick comment, we have to wrap up shortly. We're almost at the end of our time, unfortunately. So I want to go back to the media, and this I think applies more to TV than to print. But the media are being used in the current political dynamics, and they don't understand how to break that cycle. The answer is more fact-checking. I was listening to the Media and Trump panel that was a couple days ago with Ana Cabrera, who was to the moment like what you would expect CNN to say. Look, you wouldn't believe how much work we put into fact-checking. Does everybody remember the day that Mitt Romney tried to throw his body in front of Trump? That he went and he did a press announcement. He said, "Don't trust this guy. He's a terrible guy. Don't do it." And then for the next hour, CNN has a chyron, Trump to respond, a podium with flags, and on the left, talking heads, an hour of that, and then they give Trump a free hour where he pimps his hotel, crushes Romney, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm thinking, and maybe this is 2020 hindsight, but in the middle of that, if you're Jeff Schwartz, who runs their news business and is a bit beholden to Trump, by the way, you would say, stop the camera, turn it on me, and then you look at everybody and you say, my fellow Americans, I'm really sorry, but we've been hacked. I don't mean that Chinese or Russian hackers got into our servers, which they're probably doing right now. I mean that the man we've been showing you has figured out how to use us against you, and until we figure out how to fix this, we're going to show you less of him, because to him, attention is oxygen. And if we don't break that cycle, so here's a corporation, a set of corporations that need to figure this out, because we're in the beginning of the same news cycle, and they're behaving the same way that they used to.
I think we could keep talking, we could keep talking for a couple hours, but the next session would be a little crabby with us. So please join me in thanking April, Andy, Chris, and Jerry. So have a great day, everybody.